Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, we just want to let you all know that closed captioning is available. You should see a gear icon that you can click on to enable. First, we just want to welcome you all to the first webinar hosted by the University of Phoenix Office of Educational Equity. We're looking forward to hearing from our moderator and panelists today. The series was created with the hope that we could foster a learning environment where we can identify ways we play a role in moving toward greater unity and impacting change. As a higher education institution with more than 56% minority students employed across different industries, we hope to provide insight for employers and other organizations on how to actively contribute as an inclusive leader in a culturally complex society. As we move forward with hosting these webinars on the third Thursday of each month, our goal is to inspire employers and organizations to improve diversity through actions in their day-to-day practices, hiring procedures, and approaches to fostering an inclusive culture because it impacts key stakeholders. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jamal Watson, Editor-at-Large for Diverse Issues in Higher Education, as he will be our moderator today.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez, and thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. I'm sorry I'm not there with you all by camera, but had some technical difficulties, and so I'm sure you all imagined that this is sometimes how it goes. But nevertheless, we're going to have a great conversation, and again, I want to thank Ms. Lopez and Ms. Richardson for your vision and for the University of Phoenix for hosting this important educational equity webinar series. There is plenty for us to talk about, and unfortunately we only have an hour. So let me get to our panelists. I want to introduce them all to you. Dr. Jeff McGee, who is the CEO at Cross Cultural Dynamics. We have Dr. Sean C. Todd Boone, who's the Associate Dean of Instruction for the College of Doctoral Studies at the University of Phoenix. We have Jim Macy, who's the social entrepreneur and corporate change maker, and Dr. Linda Grooms-Walton, who's an author, consultant, career life coach, and founder and CEO of Achieving My Purpose. I want to thank you all for being part of this conversation. I want to start off with you, Dr. McGee, because when we talk about these difficult conversations that we often have to happen, we often don't always have the right language as we're talking about these kinds of incidents. So I want to ask that you help to define for us, what is systemic racism and where did it come from?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So I'm going to first start with where did it come from. So to understand systemic racism, you really have to understand true history. So if you don't understand true history, you won't understand systemic racism. So our history books were written from one point of view. So that's why research, for example, like Lies My Teacher Told Me, for example, by James Lowen, is transforming because it gives you new insights into history that haven't been told. So in order to understand systemic racism, we have to understand what race means. So race was created back in the early 1700s. So Europeans from in the early 1600s immigrated to what is now America to find religious freedom. So the term white emerged as a classification during the 1700s in the British colonies of North America. So what you get with white, right? It was created as a political, economic, and social construct that was used as an organizing tool to unite Europeans and to consolidate strength. So it thus increased their ability to maintain control and dominance over the natives and African slaves. So when you talk about the concept of race, right? So now when you're giving meaning to what white means, it means access. So that's when you hear whiteness is a concept that describes characteristics of the white race. So basically, having a white skin gives you access, right? And then having black skin is not access. So we go back to the 1600s, right? When we talk about race, laws were created to legally marginalize people of color. So, for example, Virginia Law 1662 said Negro women's children served according to the condition of the mother, which means if you were born by a Negro woman, you're automatically a slave. Okay. Jim Crow era, for example, referred to racial hierarchy in American life. So between the late 1870s into the mid 1960s, you had the hierarchy with whites at the top, blacks at the bottom, and it was established through laws and practices. So the main idea behind that was that whites and blacks, for example, if they shared public facilities, it would mean they're socially equal, which would destroy American culture. So in most cases, black facilities were clearly underfunded, less convenient located, and then grossly inferior to white facilities. And in some cases, they didn't even have public restrooms and then restaurants that were close to them. So those are just a couple of the laws that were established. So when you talk about systemic racism can be proved by facts, right? It's not a matter of opinion, it's factual. So systemic racism looks at racism within all functions of society. So when we look at systemic racism, we talk about the wealth gap. So and research shows in 2016, the median wealth by household, by white households, was 171,000 compared to black households, which is 17,000. You have the employment gap. So white sounding names were 50% more likely to get a callback from a job application than black sounding names. Then you have incarceration disparities, right? So out of 100,000 Americans, 700 are incarcerated. But out of the same 100,000 black men, over 4,000 are incarcerated. So you can see these are just some examples of systemic racism.
Yeah.
One of the examples I like to use, and I'll wrap up this question, is if you go to Google, pull up a Google web browser or go on your phone or something, and Google the term women's professional hairstyle. Okay, it's women's professional hairstyle. And then click on images. So when you see that, you'll see a list of, you'll see white women's hairstyle. Okay. So click on, now once you do that, click on women's unprofessional hairstyle. Click on images, and once you see that and you scroll down, you'll see a black women's hairstyle. So although that's an algorithm, the media perpetuates the concept of race, right? It shows black people as less than, and it shows people in more affluent positions of authority.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the understanding, the concept behind systemic racism and where it came from here in America.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. McGee. And it's a nice tie-in, I think, to my question for Dr. Walton, which is how does this systemic racism impact women of color leaders differently? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about how?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Walton, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for that question.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, yes. In fact, I just recently did a dissertation for my doctorate on this very issue, and what we discovered was there was what's considered double jeopardy with women of color, that the racism or the discrimination falls with them as it relates to them being women, and it also addresses their issues as they are Black or African American or whatever women of color that they may represent. And so while we try to identify their experiences based on either women or their race, in fact, the fact that they have the combination, there is a uniqueness about some of the experiences that they have that probably Black men do not experience and white women do not experience. So those kinds of things that they are facing, they tend to be put in the lower echelon behind men of color, behind white women, and then women of color are then perceived. So because those who are in power have limited exposure and experience with women of color, they're not typically the ones that may sponsor or allow them to have opportunities for senior level positions. Some of the experiences they have are lack of informal network. They feel very isolated because they typically are the only ones, and very often their voice is not noted.
Yeah, I want to. That's really helpful, Dr. Walton. I want to stay with you for a minute because, you know, one of the things I think is so important in this discussion is we think about what are some of the solutions that we can kind of propose as we navigate these very difficult terrain. So what should women of color leaders and other marginalized individuals do to help themselves, given the context and the problem that you just laid out for us?
Good question. Some of the experiences that I have had when talking to these women who have been successful in this level, one has been when they're getting performance reviews, and oftentimes they don't get constructive feedback. They may ask and demand constructive feedback, and if they continue to get nonchalant responses, then they should ask, well, what does it take for me to get to the next level? And then they'll either get constructive feedback or they need to be prepared to put into the next level. I think the other is to toot your own horn, which is very counter to what many women of color would like to do. And so because they're not noticed, they need to do that. Also identify allies and try to get to know them on a personal basis, because we do recognize that fit and feeling comfortable and being trustworthy are things that those in decision-making positions need to have. So if you have to reach out to identify allies, do so. And then lastly, which is sometimes a little difficult for women of color, is try to participate in the informal networks, be willing to do things outside of the corporate environment, to participate in golf or participate in outside activities with your colleagues and senior executives.
Yeah, all great suggestions. Thank you, Dr. Walton. I want to move to Dr. Boone if we can, because one of the things, Dr. Walton, you talked about is the importance of having allies. So I was wondering, Dr. Boone, can you define what allyship means and how can it be demonstrated, particularly in educational institutions?
Thank you, Dr. Watson, for the question. I define an ally as a person who actively engages in creating a culture of inclusion through intentional and conscious efforts to within the organization. To me, allyship is the process of building relationships with marginalized individuals or groups. We in higher education should consider our allyship through advocacy, and the creation of broad and narrow policies that drive diversity and inclusion. Unfortunately, there have been some misgivings in the allyship by some in higher education. For instance, when the California voters approved Proposition 209, which was the 1996 ban on affirmative action and included college and university admissions, a ban that the University of California Board of Regents supported in 1995, the hope of a race-neutral admissions has left the UC student population unrepresentative of the state's economic, ethnic, and cultural diversity. Those who opposed Proposition 209 foreshadowed this reality. But now today, the University of California Board of Regents just recently supports the current push to end the ban. In all, 10 states have enacted bans on affirmative action, including Arizona in 2010. Now, as you know, we have lots of intentions in diversity and inclusion, including thought. But here's my concern with the idea of thought or difference in opinions as a category in diversity or claiming to be diverse. If everyone at the table looks alike or even comes from a similar background, such as socioeconomic upbringing, then the conversations at the table are still void of the experiences of the others. And when attempting to represent others, we fundamentally miss the call to serve and inspire those who are marginalized. So when we look at the University of Phoenix and we look at what we do, I call our work that of allies. Whereas in other institutions, the selective admissions criteria propagates categorically separation and segregation. The University of Phoenix, one could argue, took the lead from our community college partners to maintain an open enrollment admissions process to educate all who have a desire to learn. And this is our service to the public good. It was not until the University of Phoenix's in our country really donned the higher education structure, offering bachelor's, master's, and doctorates, challenging the status quo by open enrollment and open access, that the real promise of educational opportunities became a reality for Black and Brown communities, and considered how best to serve considerably growing marginalized population of working adults. So lastly, and as a takeaway, within our educational environments, allyship should be demonstrated by listening to those around us, believing their experiences and their truths, in emotional empathy, becoming comfortable with our discomfort and placing ourselves in each other's shoes, a real cognitive empathy, and by being change agents for change. Allies should exist at all levels of the educational institution, including students, faculty, staff, and administrators.
Yeah, Dr. Boone, I want to stay with you for a minute because I think it was really interesting as you laid out the stats relating to University of Phoenix, and we know that the majority of the students there are non-white. And I was wondering, given this fact, I mean, in many ways, I imagine that the university is seen as a model for the nation. But can you talk about, given those demographics, how do you envision change even taking place at your institution?
Great question, Dr. Watson. Educational institutions, I think, should be dedicated to the belief, as I work and aspire to be, that the pen is mightier than the sword. And as we know, as we continue to guide our students to be policymakers and make positive change within their fields, particularly as working adults for us. So really, I think to expand beyond the narrow focus of the University of Phoenix in higher education, we can no longer express outrage or codify a response with a commitment to justice. These are empty promises and exacerbate a long history of brutal injustice, of a failed reconstruction and desperate treatment to the reconciliation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which in the end, some 244 years after we commenced as a nation, has states calling for national health emergencies for our Black and Brown neighbors and worldwide protests for equal justice for all. As allies, higher education can no longer accept the lie of the promise of things will change following tragedies that we have seen that elevate discussions like these from events that we have witnessed really as of late. We must be a beacon of hope for which we were created, to expand the ideals of good at the epistemological core and the ontological flexibility that transforms for the greater good the principles and thinking of this great society. So we know that now more than ever, Black students are attending colleges and universities. However, Blacks still navigate towards the same types of professions, in part because we lack the mentorships within some of our higher education institutions. And we still have issues with attracting Black men into K-12, teaching and Blacks and women's into STEM programs and careers. So the research is not why are 2% of Black Americans entering into K-12 to teach. The research is how do we as higher education offer these K-12 mentorship programs to help conjoin our commitment to innovate and inspire more interest in these fields, particularly in K-12 and with students in K-12 and at the community college levels. So our affinity for research should be to lead change in the work our students do, mainly because it makes no sense for students to study without leading the change. And we know that recently a lot of institutions are changing and hiring, creating director, chief diversity officer positions in HR to look strategically at the overall broader community and the institution itself. And it's not just the work of the HR department again. So I see, as the Associate Dean of Instruction for Doctoral Studies, a lot of dissertations researching the lack of equal representation at educational and administrative levels. And so what we need more of are those opportunities for students to focus on their career trajectories and to partner with outside and broader institutions to support all students who enter into our hallowed halls.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, when we think about the kinds of racial inequities that exist, the burden, of course, cannot fall simply on people of color to address the issues. White people have to be involved as well. So I want to move to Mr. Macy and talk about how can white privilege be recognized, and how can this be used to advocate for others within any organization?
So white privilege is easily accepted when you look for it. And I think for me, several years ago, I had the audacity to tell a group of friends that I didn't experience privilege. And it was a dear friend who laughed and said, "Oh, sweet boy, you know, I'm from the state of Missouri." He said, "Oh, sweet boy, you don't understand. You represent all 17 dimensions." And I know right now that we've spent a lot of time talking about race, but I think that, you know, Dr. Boone started to highlight issues around education. And, you know, when I was prepping for this, you know, one of the interesting things and one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to join the University of Phoenix First Call, because 10 years ago, I was told as a hiring manager, we weren't going to look at resumes from the University of Phoenix. And when I listen to Dr. McGee talk about systemic racism, and I think about access to information, and I think about equal access to education and the lies that I was told as a white person, discovering my privilege and how easy it is for me to spend it to benefit others is the drastic shift that has to start to take place. And so for me, when University of Phoenix asked me to join, I thought, here's one way that I can show the leadership of an institution that started to address an educational gap, started to train people, and by the way, several years ago, it was 10 years ago, I was told we didn't hire, but then once I started to understand that it was part of the systemic white supremacy that I had been surrounded with all my life, I started to break through that. And so understanding my white privilege, being aware of it, and then understanding how I could start making conscious decisions to change. And it was that when I had positions, I stopped putting an educational requirement in for most of my positions around the world, because it was about experiences. It was about the pursuit and adaptability of learning agility, not a degree or a pedigree of degrees. And so it was little things like that that I could start doing, but it took the recognition. And I'll tell you, as I've continued down my journey, the continuation of partnerships. I think it was Dr. Walton talked about women of color need to find allies. I've always considered myself an advocate. And when someone is willing to reach out and be a peer mentor for me to help me understand the difference that I can make, the difference that I can do, little things like I enjoy vivid colors. I'm an artist in my personal life. So I try to wear really bold clothes. And you can imagine in a professional setting for a white man, that's not common. And the reason I do it every time, I'm not able to be on video today, but I'm in a bright orange fish shirt, because I want someone who looks like me to comment about my attire. And every time they do, I say, why do you think it's appropriate to talk about my attire? And it's often something like, why are you wearing that shirt? Or, wow, you look good. I'm like, you know, why are you talking about my attire? You're gonna next talk about my hairstyle or my body image? Come on, we're better than this. And it allows me to start setting norms of, it doesn't matter what we look like, how we're dressed, but it's also me showing up authentically. And I understand that it's easy for me because of the privilege that I get to have access everywhere, but it allows me to start using my voice to talk about why should this matter and how can that change, and start getting to the bare issues that so many colleagues face when they're just getting up and thinking about, you know, how do I need to dress, and Dr. McGee, it was so eye-opening. I was on Google and doing the professional and unprofessional hairstyles. I've never had to worry about it. And so I think understanding my privilege and beginning to spend it, and as soon as I start getting overwhelmed, finding the right mentors to continue to help me pursue further, to have the difficult conversations, to not be afraid about explaining it and maybe getting it wrong, but at least I'm saying it out loud. Those are the critical parts about spending privilege that we need to do. And then the final thing I'll say is, I know many colleagues right now are telling me that they're tired. And I try to empathize as much as I can. At the same time, it's so new. And, you know, just this week, a friend of mine, you know, we were talking about the murder of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. And she said, how can you white people not see that? And I asked her to let me say it in the 10-year-old Jim versus the 46-year-old Jim. And we're able to have a very honest dialogue that allowed me to become better educated to address why in the racism, people view that as a human disrespecting police versus a Black man who has been raised to be feared from the white supremacy of policing of people of color, and that he simply wanted to get to his daughter's birthday and knew if he didn't do that, he would never see his daughter, and out of fear might not anyway, but he wanted to fight for his family. Boy, that's a different narrative that I never had the privilege of knowing growing up. And that's the privilege that I'm now trying to spend today.
Yeah. No, well said. I'm curious to know, given all of these incidents that have happened and the response that has been generated, I'm wondering, are you hopeful that things are shifting and changing more positively, where individuals are willing to have those conversations? I'm just curious.
My friend, I love that question. It's one that there's a network of friends that I've had for almost 30 years. And every Friday night at 8 p.m. we get together. We're spread out across the country. We're in upstate New York. We're in Missouri, which is a hotbed for these issues, predominantly outside of St. Louis. I live in Washington, D.C., and the other friend is in Houston. And two of them said, oh, we really think it's progressing. What I'm seeing are two things. I'm seeing more and more whites going down a journey of awakening where they're willing to have that conversation. But I'm also physically sick at the amount of whites who are digging their feet in deeper, and you know, the rise of the nationalism, the white supremacy, not in the context of the country being built, but that the white supremacy of this race is better and we will fight for it to be better. I'm seeing that get stronger, and that is what makes me physically sick. So I do believe the fluency with which many within my circle are broadening their understanding of these phrases and fluency of race. I'm also seeing so many shut the door to even being open to it because they're still viewing it as a zero-sum game.
Interesting. Dr. McGee, what are you seeing? What are you experiencing? We know the long legacy of systemic racism, as you outlined. We know the resistance to it. Are you hopeful at this moment that things are beginning to shift at all?
Yeah, that's a real good question. I think, you know, ever since things have transpired over, I would say, the past month or two, I'm slowly seeing a shift in leaders becoming more aware, people becoming more aware of what's going on. And to Mr. Massey's point, you know, there's also people digging their heels in deeper, right, and trying to defend what they're calling, you know, American values and norms. So I'm slowly seeing a shift, and those are the people that I want to work with, the ones that are, you know, wanting to make changes. But again, there's still a group out there that's digging their heels in it. And one of the things I like to tell people is, I like people to understand that there's this concept in organizational development called loop learning. And when you look at what's called the triple loop, as far as that learning framework, the triple loop asks the question, it says we need to learn how we learn by reviewing how we learned in the first place. So what we need to do is go back to the context, the foundation of how we learned about racism, how we learned about systemic barriers and challenges to blacks and browns here in America. And then we need to relearn using different methods and looking outside of, like I said before, history books and where our families have told us and what the education system has told us that's true about history, and learn something new. So we need to analyze that from a 30,000 view and say, okay, we need to relearn how we learned, because the way we learned is from one perspective. So that's kind of what I would say to that question there.
Thank you. I want to also include Dr. Walton and Dr. Boone as well. I'm curious to know your thoughts about where we are in the wake of these more recent incidents. Dr. Walton?
I think there's a lot of hope that we're seeing progress. I can remember the protests many, many years ago and who was involved in that process. Now you see much more diversity of people in it. I also understand that in transforming an environment as it relates to racism or any kind of transformation, it starts with some level of agitation, which we obviously are seeing, and then it moves into a proclamation that is an understanding that there's a need for some change, there's a need for policy, and then ultimately some action. And so while we see a lot of things changing right now, we see corporations changing their branding on products like Aunt Jemima. We're seeing things happening in the sports arena and so forth. Those things, they're happening because of all the agitation, but it's certainly a start, and hopefully we can continue it. And I think the way it can be sustained is for us to understand the value and the benefit of the diversity and embracing diversity and diffusing racism, because there is a benefit for all of us. Nobody really loses, even though there are a lot of whites that think they may lose in this process, but we all will win. And when people can really understand that, then we'll have even more accelerated positive things going on.
Thank you. Dr. Boone?
Thank you, Dr. Watson. And I agree with all of the panelists. I think we have what I think has been most impending for me about what we've seen is the continuation, the progression, this sort of movement, which when these incidents come up, we have a bit of civil unrest, and then it sort of subsides. And we have seen, what we sort of will call this spring, if you will, of fight for justice. I think we have a lot of movement to make. And when I think higher education wise, and I've been fighting for these issues when I last counted for 29 years, for good community policing, a seat at the table for Black, Brown, for all people of color, for men, women, for LGBTQ folks as well, and their allies. And so as long as we have folks feeling like they can achieve the pinnacle, and when I say folks, I'm namely talking about folks of color, that they can achieve the pinnacle, the doctoral degree, and yet feel like that this idea of clinging to their books and hoping for a dream still does not get them an adequate seat at the table, then we have a lot more fighting to do. And so, the Center for American Progress in a recent study found that white women earn 79%, I think it was, of what is earned by white men. But African American women earn 62 cents to the dollar compared to the earnings of white men. Until we can rectify these issues, we have a lot of work to do. And we have to consider it in our allyship. I think when Dr. McGee talked about the triple loop learning, what's so critical and essential in that is that we have essentially developed mental models. And so being the sort of blind, if you will, the blind men, women looking at the elephant, asking, is this a trunk? Is this a tree? Is this a snake? Until we can begin that perspective switching, that ontological expansion, we still have a lot of work to do. And so, and hopefully we can do that work together. We have to do that work together to help really ease some of the civil unrest and to show that indeed a new dawn has set, and we are leading as particularly for me and the students I serve in higher education, leading from the front and willing to take those risks.
Yeah. And I'm curious in terms of higher ed, because we've witnessed the steady flurry of statements that colleges and universities put out after many of these incidents. And I'm wondering if we could drill down a little bit, since the focus of this is educational equity, what institutions of higher education learning can do to really foster that. I mean, does that mean doing a better job at recruiting and retaining faculty of color? What does that look like? How do you reimagine us dealing with these educational equity issues, particularly from the vantage point of higher education? And I want to go to Dr. McGee, and then we can work our way around.
Yeah, that's a good question, Dr. Walton. I think for me, it has to start with leadership. I believe leadership has to set the tone for the organization as far as culture is concerned. So setting the tone in the shape of policies and hiring practices, and this is what we're going to do. I think it has to start there with our and from the work I've done over the many years within this space, and myself being a leader of an organization, it's just simply a leader has to be culturally competent, right? We have to understand what systemic racism is and understand systems that marginalize people, and then make the change. Just say, hey, this is the direction we're going as an organization. To me, it's that simple, right? So and also I want to add in, educating leaders is extremely important on systemic racism and reasons why dismantling these systems are so important. Ever since the George Floyd incident happened, I've been getting a lot of phone calls and emails from leaders saying I never even heard of systemic racism before. I've never seen it before, right? So being educated and us doing these webinars and these panels like this is a great start to educating people on how we can start on these systems. So in my opinion, I'd say we would start with leaders.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else want to hop in on the higher education piece and what can be done on that front?
I would like to add a couple of things. I think that one of the things they could do is measure their progress and their efforts. As we do on anything else, anything that is important, that we measure it. I also believe, and I know there are a lot of D&I professionals on the call, that even though educational institutions and corporations may have a diversity department, and oftentimes they relegate the responsibility to that department, which is extremely unfair. I led an department like this in the private sector myself, and it really is a joint effort. It was mentioned that leaders should be involved. I think all organizational departments, HR and D&I, but use D&I as a resource and not hold them accountable for all of the efforts, and that it's all universal. Those are the kind of things that we should do.
Yeah. Well, also it's to the point that diversity and equity work has to be shared responsibility across an entire institution, right? It can't simply be left to 2 or 3 people to do this important work. It really has to be embedded in both the strategic plan and the vision of an institution. I mean, would you agree?
I would definitely agree. I'm not sure if you're talking to me or Dr. Walton or
Go ahead.
to anyone, but I would just definitely agree. And that is something that we have made a concerted effort to in doctoral studies, particularly this year, to really focus on in our strategic plan and our alignment to the university's goals. The hiring of doctoral studies. The majority of our students are people of color. And a considerable amount, a percentage of African American women, but ensuring that we are mentoring those students before they leave our program with scholarship, with research, so that then they can really go against or with and next to any individual at any institution earning a doctoral degree with that scholarship leaving our program, but also adding to the strategic goal, the faculty hiring, and considering and making sure that students want to see faculty, staff, and administrators who look like themselves, to feel that the university is hearing their best interests, and to provide them with a sense of hope regarding their career trajectories, even though our students are working adults. What are the possibilities for them is the question they ask. And so it has to be part of the strategic plan university-wide, and it has to be the entire institution who's leading this essentially paradigm shift for change.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to move. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing I want to say is in the corporate sector, one of the concerns that I have is that I'm seeing the D&I positions being reserved for representatives of the marginalized groups. And even with the recent movement here in the US on Black Lives, executive teams of white people, and particularly CEOs, submitting these statements saying we stand with you. And it takes me to Ms. Watson of Australia, who said, if you're coming to check in on me, please keep walking. But if my freedom is tied to your freedom, then stand and let's work together. And one of the concerns I have with what I'm seeing is a colleague of mine wrote a beautiful paper talking about the struggle she has as an executive communications writer. And her name is Dion Gray. And if you go to LinkedIn, you can see her writing. But it talks about the trauma of racism. Similar to that, she compares it to that of a woman being raped. And that if some trauma like that were to happen, we don't ask the employee to come in the next day and to write papers for the white CEO to talk about sexual assault. And that every day when she's seeing more people who look like her murdered, or the experience of the systemic racism, for as much as she's had, she's still coming in and helping the white CEO write a memo. And just the trauma that's experiencing. And so I think the thing I want to highlight is, I know one thing I try to do is highlight that when we're doing D&I, it is not the marginalized group's responsibility to tell us what they're part of the conversation, let us know what's not working, but it's ultimately the whites who need to do the fundamental shift and changing, because within the organizations I've been a part, they're still leading the finance, the legal, the sales group, the commercial group, the P&L responsibility. And it's why we aren't seeing the diversity in those roles. We're seeing them in the enabling units, in HR, in the D&I space. And I want to be excited about that, because they're getting a seat on the C-suite floor, but the influence and the decision making is still where I think we have so much more room to make.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And I also think it's critically important to understand that doing this work requires training, and everyone can't do it. And I think, sometimes after these incidents where things happen, we are so quick to say we need to get this position filled, and we need to say that we're an advocate for diversity and hire someone to do these, to serve in these roles without the sufficient training. And of course, if you have someone in these roles without that training, you can actually do more harm than good. So I think we ought to keep that in mind as well. Let's go to a question if we can. And this is kind of related to what you were just talking about. This question says, as we move forward with improved understanding and illumination and action on educational equity, how can we come back and address the pain, fear, and hurt to allow us to better communicate and heal the racial and other diversity and inclusion divides? Anybody want to take that? That's a very good question.
I'd like to start on that.
Okay.
As you talk about the pain and so forth, I think one thing we don't do is those who might be white don't say, I can relate to or I appreciate your pain, because I don't think they can. So all they can do is listen and acknowledge the pain and hurt that people are experiencing and try to understand better what that emotional tax is and what kinds of things can we jointly do to improve on that. But it's one of those things that when someone is paining, you have to just acknowledge that they're hurt and maybe even ask them what kinds of things that can be done, but don't actually make it seem like I have a similar hurt and I can appreciate with what you're experiencing.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Dr. Walton just said, and which she's referring to is that, empathy versus sympathy, right? Mm-hmm. So when we're empathizing with people, I visually picture you're putting your arm around their shoulder, just saying, I hear you, right? You're not trying to solve the problem, you're just listening, using active listening skills. And in addition to that, having safe spaces within our educational institutions where people can come and voice their frustration and their experiences. So without being judged, without people saying, well, no, that's not the reality or that's not how things are, we have to have and create these community forums, these safe spaces for people to come and voice their frustrations. So that's where I would go with that.
Very good. We have a question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, one thing I was going to say is that everything described by my fellow panelists is I get, and it's also really hard. A lot of the work I do also is around ending the stigma of mental illness in society, and it's so challenging because I think, one of the things I've stopped doing is I no longer ask how people are. I asked them to share with me, what are the 3 words you would describe as your biggest learning during the environmental, health, and racial issues we're facing today? And because if we as a society are taught, I'm good, right? I think, one of the things that several colleagues have shared is the concept of a mask that must be put on and you must be strong when you enter the workforce. I think all of us have that to some degree. And so I think that this is where, I'm not speaking for all whites, but for me, I don't like to have someone hurting around me. It doesn't make it right or wrong, but empathy and sympathy is a very mature and a very high emotional intelligence differentiation, even though the basics of the definition are quite different. And I've seen time and time again, white people with the white tears, and and I've been part of that throughout my career, and it's just asinine, I know, but on the humanity level of it, it's a challenge. And I think that is one of the things keeping many whites from jumping into this space, because they want to fix it instead of just hear, and worse, hear how they have contributed. Because that's the part that is the most heart-wrenching, is for me to sit here and tell a group of diverse people I am racist, I have benefited from racism, and I'm fighting to be anti-racism and learning how feels odd as a 46-year-old white male of Christian descent that believes I've been doing good all of my life, because I haven't.
Yeah. And it's critically important to distinguish, as you point out, that there's a difference between being anti-racist and simply saying that you're not racist, as Dr. Ibram X. Kendi writes in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so I think it's important that people recognize that distinction. I want to go to the next question, and that is, how do we, and I want this for Dr. McGee, how do we as allies support our law enforcement men and women while also supporting the fight for equality in a meaningful way in this current climate?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So I just want to say, when we're supporting law enforcement and with everything going on, what I've been telling people to do and what I've been doing myself, it all boils down to relationships. So one of the things that we do is we, having coffee meetings with people in law enforcement, sitting down and sharing different perspectives, right? It's all about relationship building. And I've seen a tremendous value in that. So I would just say, let's start building some relationships. Let's start understanding each other's perspectives, right? Because it goes back to what we were talking about before. If we're going to start breaking down systemic barriers, we need to start creating safe spaces for people to have these conversations, for people to, without bias, without judgment, just being able to be authentic, be real, transparent, and say, hey, this is some of the things I've experienced with law enforcement. And then on the other side, law enforcement said, these are some of the things I've experienced, right? So we can just have an understanding of each other and start building relationships and work together to start dismantling systemic barriers.
Yeah. Dr. Walton, did you want to jump in on that one? Dr. Walton? Okay, we'll move on to the next question.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead. I was wondering if you wanted to jump in on that. Yeah.
I do, because I too have actually had a relationship with law enforcement here in Scottsdale, where I'm a part of a community engagement where we are having that safe dialogue and having an understanding and discussion about the community and what can the law enforcement and civilians do. But also I have been, as my role as a diversity practitioner, have been training the sheriff's department and other law enforcement people, just like I train in the private sector. And one of the things that the law enforcement people talk about a lot is, I understand there's a learning here, but at the same time, it would be so beneficial that in those audiences, that it be a mixture of not only law enforcement people, but civilians as well, so that people can really see the point of view of both sides, because we seem to be training people in silos, and yet there's a lot of benefit in understanding the challenges that some of the law enforcement people go through. I had a brother that was an officer, and the challenges that even being a man of color in the law enforcement community is a challenge. So just having those dialogues and having the training where it's inclusive of civilians as well as officers would be beneficial.
Yeah, thank you very much. Next question, how do we shift people from their positions of being simply observers to being activists and allies? And, this is a question that I think has really surfaced quite a bit, and a number of you touched on it. This questioner said the problem in question is, how do we get diverse people who are in power to use the power and authority that they have to improve situations for the disenfranchised? Dr. Todd Boone, did you want to tackle that one?
It's a great question, and it is one I have been, subjecting to really understanding, because you can make the case for why it's a good cause, but because of those mental models, folks are they're in their comfort, and so I think part of it is that individuals have to want to move beyond the comfort of where they are. I remember an episode of The Good Wife, which was one of my favorite shows, and there were two episodes, one in November of 2015 in their last season, that dealt with Monica Timmons, and I suggest that everyone sort of go Google and watch that episode. It's a powerful episode. Of a young attorney, African-American attorney, who graduated from, I believe it was one of the Loyolas, and she was wanted by the white partner, but the two white male partners were adamant that they did not want her. And so it sort of escalates from there. But one of the things that comes out in that episode is that people are comfortable with working with individuals they know. And if we don't get beyond that discomfort of working with people in our organizations who are not like us, who we don't know, then we never essentially break down and build allies, and those individuals never become allies. And so I think it's part, for me at least, that Sarah Gimsky quote that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, that all I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks and permit us to stand upright. And so to be an ally, you people are going to have to want to. And yes, we can have those conversations with them. We can have them to, we're blue on the face. But until individuals are forced to have those conversations and forced to look at their own mental model, nothing changes. This sort of referendum on authority wasn't something just because of the physical issues that we've seen with the police, going back to that. You can do both. You can support law enforcement. You can support the cause for equal justice, is what it is, and not jumping to conclusions. But it's not just a referendum on that. It's a referendum also on the mental and the spiritual impact that groups have endured, and that's why essentially they're called marginalized. So we've got to have those conversations, but people and institutions are going to have to want to change.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. We are out of time, but I want to thank each one of you for engaging in these very important conversations and to helping to move the needle as we confront issues around equity. We have to have those conversations, and so I'm eternally grateful to the University of Phoenix for creating a space for us to be engaged in this dialogue. Thank you all for allowing me to moderate it, and I'm going to turn it now over to Ms. Lopez.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Before we end this, I would like to share with all of you the launch and execution of this educational equity webinar series is a prime example of how important it is to have leadership at the top, supporting issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Active leadership engagement is crucial to bring these equity and inclusion efforts to fruition and properly embed them into company-wide policies, procedures, strategic goals, and objectives, thus impacting change within systems that were historically built for a society not as culturally diverse as what we live in today. So thank you all for joining today's webinar. You will be receiving an email from us with a link of the recording, a reading list, resources, our speakers' contact information, as well as a link for you to register for our next webinar on July 16th, where we will be discussing Where is My Privilege? Future Challenges for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.